Welcome to a Christmas unlike any other. In Merry Mead, where the snow hides secrets, love turns to betrayal, and Miss Marple uncovers a truth colder than the winter night itself. Stay with us. Every whisper matters. In a peaceful village glittering with Christmas charm, a single gunshot shatters the joy. Beneath the carols and candles, Miss Marple senses deceit wrapped in ribbons and whispered lies. Where are you listening from tonight, my curious friends? Is it quiet where you are, or does the silence feel like it's hiding something? Have you ever trusted someone so deeply, only to discover they were the danger all along? Tell me below, because sometimes the truth you share says more than the story itself. The snow had come early that year, thick and soft as flour, powdering the rooftops of Merry Mead and muffling the chiming bells of St. Peter's Church. The villagers moved briskly through the lanes, their cheeks pink with cold, their minds fixed on holly wreaths, plum puddings, and last-minute parcels. From the post office to the greengrocer's, conversations sparkled with the warmth of the season and with gossip, which was the village's most persistent form of entertainment. At the heart of it all, standing by her drawing-room window in her neat pink cardigan, Miss Jane Marple watched the snowfall with the mild, thoughtful gaze of one who notices everything and comments on nothing. She was knitting naturally a rather handsome scarf in grey wool for her nephew Raymond, though her thoughts were elsewhere. There was something in the air. She felt not just frost, but tension. Villages had their rhythms, their unspoken moods, and lately Merry Meads had been ever so slightly strained. Perhaps it had to do with the arrival of the Hewitts at Old Manor House. Colonel Hewitt had been a man of distinction in India, but it was his young wife, Celia, who had captured the attention of the locals, strikingly pretty. Too modern in her clothes, and quite shameless in her friendliness. Too friendly, said Mrs. Price Ridley, with a sniff at the Christmas bazaar. A woman who smiles that much must be hiding something. Miss Marple had smiled mildly at that, for she knew from experience that women who smiled too much were indeed hiding something, though not always the thing one expected. The gossip deepened as Christmas approached. There was talk of a dinner party at the manor on Christmas Eve, a lavish affair with champagne, crystal, and a mysterious guest of honor. Invitations had gone out selectively, and Mrs. Bantry of Gossington Hall had confided to Miss Marple that she found it all rather suspiciously theatrical. Something about the tone, Mrs. Bantry had said, adjusting her feathered hat. As if they wanted to show off or prove a point, Miss Marple had replied softly. People seldom throw parties to prove nothing, dear Dolly. There's always a reason, though one must wait for it to appear. That reason appeared sooner than anyone expected. On Christmas Eve, as the church choir rehearsed carols in the freezing nave and the scent of roast goose drifted down from cottage chimneys, a scream tore through the night. It came from the direction of Old Manor House, a single, shattering cry that echoed over the snow before being swallowed by silence. Within minutes, half the village was awake, rushing through the white drifts with lanterns and torches. Miss Marple followed at a measured pace, her boots crunching quietly. She knew that when people ran, they often saw only what they expected to see. It was better to arrive late and see what was actually there. At the manor, the grand hall doors stood ajar, and the wreath of holly and scarlet ribbon hung askew. Inside, chaos reigned. The dinner guests were gathered near the fire, pale and trembling, while Mrs. Hewitt sobbed uncontrollably in the arms of the vicar's wife. On the floor, by the hearth, beneath a scattering of broken glass and spilt claret, lay the body of Colonel Hewitt. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling's painted angels, his face curiously peaceful save for the neat, dark wound just below the collarbone. The local constable, young Inspector Graves, was already on the scene, sweating despite the cold. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," he murmured when he saw her. "Appears he was shot, though nobody heard a thing until Mrs. Hewitt screamed." "Ah," Miss Marple said gently, her eyes scanning the faces in the room, the nervous maid, the silent butler, the fluttering guests, and the tear-streaked widow whose grief seemed a shade too theatrical. "But screaming," she murmured, "is sometimes heard only after the truth has arrived." And then, noticing a small, peculiar detail that nobody else had a sprig of mistletoe crushed beneath Colonel Hewitt's hand, Miss Marple felt the first quiet stirrings of suspicion. Christmas, she thought, had always been a time for goodwill and forgiveness. But here, beneath the frosted windows of Mary Mead, it seemed someone had decided it was also a time for reckoning. The following morning dawned pale and silent, the snow lying like a white shroud across the hedgerows and churchyard stones. Mary Mead awoke to the shocking realization that murder, cold, deliberate murder, had visited their peaceful village once again. News traveled faster than the milk van. By the time Miss Marple set down her teacup and buttered toast, 3 different versions of the event had already reached her doorstep. According to Mrs. Price Ridley, the colonel had been shot by a jealous husband. Mrs. Bantry insisted it was a burglary gone wrong. And Mrs. Hartnell, who always took a grim delight in tragedy, claimed she had predicted it all along. Miss Marple, naturally, made no comment. She merely folded her napkin neatly, adjusted her shawl, and decided that a visit to the vicarage was in order. It was a sensible place to begin, for the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, had been among the guests at the Hewitts' Christmas Eve dinner, and was now, as everyone knew, in a most delicate state. When Miss Marple arrived, Mrs. Clement was pale but talkative, a dangerous combination for anyone with secrets. "Oh, Jane, it was dreadful," she said, clutching a handkerchief embroidered with holly leaves. "We were just finishing the pudding when the lights flickered. You know how unreliable the wiring is in those old houses. And then there was a sound, like a snap or a pop, though at the time I thought it was the firewood. Then poor Celia screamed, and we saw him. Oh, Jane, it was ghastly." Miss Marple listened, eyes lowered, fingers folded in her lap. "You say the lights flickered, my dear, just once?" "Yes. Only briefly. Long enough for everyone to glance up. 17, 17, 17. When they came on again, Colonel Hewitt was slumped in his chair, and Celia was standing beside him with her glass shattered on the floor." "And no one saw a weapon?" "None at all. Inspector Graves said it must have been hidden or thrown somewhere, but they searched everywhere, even the pudding bowls." Miss Marple nodded, though her mind was quietly elsewhere. A pop or a snap, she thought, an odd description of a gunshot. More likely a small caliber weapon, perhaps even muffled. But what intrigued her more was Mrs. Clement's phrasing. Celia was standing beside him. There was something too neat, too rehearsed about the image. Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple walked slowly through the village lane, her stick pressing delicate marks in the snow. From behind curtains, faces peered out, and whispers followed her like the rustle of dry leaves. She paused briefly at the post office, where Mr. Thomas was in lively conversation with a delivery boy. "They say she fainted right away," the boy was saying, "but Mrs. Bantry swears she saw Mrs. Hewitt whisper something before she screamed." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Whispering before screaming," she murmured softly, "is rather like locking the stable door before the horse bolts. Curious behavior, indeed." By late afternoon, the entire village had divided itself neatly into 2 camps, those who pitied the beautiful widow and those who distrusted her entirely. Colonel Hewitt, it was generally agreed, had been a proud and sometimes difficult man, known for his temper and sharp tongue. "No saint," said Dr. Haydock, polishing his spectacles, "but not the sort one expects to be shot over the Christmas pudding." Miss Marple agreed. People rarely killed for one reason alone. It was nearly always a collection of small irritations, grudges, and hidden fears, all tied together by opportunity. She spent the evening quietly by the fire, knitting and thinking, replaying the fragments of gossip that had already surfaced. A flickering light, a shattered glass, a crushed sprig of mistletoe, and a scream that came just a little too late. It was, she thought, a pattern faint but forming. And though the villagers whispered of burglars and jealousies, Miss Marple knew better. There was something distinctly human and distinctly selfish behind this Christmas tragedy. Outside, the church bell tolled for evening prayers, and Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily on. Somewhere in the village, she felt certain, someone was trying very hard to appear calm, and she had learned long ago that guilt seldom slept soundly. The next morning, Inspector Graves arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, not, as he later insisted, to seek her help, but merely to exchange observations. His youth lent him confidence, his inexperience lent him mistakes. Still, he was earnest enough to win Miss Marple's gentle approval. He stood awkwardly near the hearth, removing his hat and stamping snow from his boots. "Strange business, Miss Marple," he said, accepting her offer of tea. The coroner confirmed the colonel was shot with a small pistol, probably from close range, yet not a trace of powder on anyone's hands, and no weapon found. Guests were seated all around the table, and the servants were in the pantry. Impossible situation. "Impossible things happen rather frequently, Inspector," Miss Marple replied mildly, handing him a cup. "Especially when people think them so. I take it you've questioned everyone?" "Of course. But they all tell the same story. Lights flicker, the pop, Mrs. Hewitt screams, and the colonel's dead. Not one of them saw a thing. No one left their seat. No strange movement. Nothing." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly, eyes thoughtful. "And Mrs. Hewitt herself?" Graves hesitated. "Shaken. Claims she and the colonel had been perfectly happy, though others suggest there'd been quarrels. There's talk of jealousy, some young man, a Mr. Paul Tressida, but she denies it." "Ah, jealousy." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It's rather like influenza, Inspector. Spreads quickly and leaves people feverish, but it seldom kills. Pride, however, has far sharper teeth." Graves frowned at that, unsure whether she was joking. "We've also found something odd," he said, setting down his cup. A mark on the tablecloth, faint, circular, as if from a wineglass, but too far from any place setting, almost on the edge, near where the colonel fell. "A wineglass, you say?" "Yes, though it was empty. No lipstick, no prints. Mrs. Hewitt's glass shattered, but this one was still whole." She nodded slowly. "So the colonel's last drink may not have been his own. Curious, isn't it, how people sometimes hand others their glass without realizing what gesture they make? It can mean friendship or something else entirely." After the inspector left, Miss Marple sat for a long time by the window, her knitting idle in her lap. The snow had stopped falling, and the children of Mary Mead were building a snowman in the green, laughing, arguing, falling over. The innocence of it made her smile, but her mind stayed fixed on the darker side of human nature. The Christmas table at Old Manor House, 12 people, flickering lights. Laughter turned to silence. Somewhere in that frozen moment, someone had seized the opportunity to act on a motive long brewing. Later that afternoon, she paid a polite call to Mrs. Hewitt. The widow received her in a room heavy with the scent of lilies, far too many, Miss Marple thought, for comfort. Celia Hewitt was pale but perfectly composed, dressed in black silk and framed against the window like a portrait. Her voice trembled just enough to suggest fragility, though her eyes told another story entirely. "How kind of you to come, Miss Marple," she said softly. "It's all been such a dreadful blur. I can hardly believe he's gone." Miss Marple offered her condolences and accepted a cup of tea, though she barely sipped it. "I remember you mentioned at the bazaar, Mrs. Hewitt, that the colonel had a fondness for collecting curiosities, pistols among them." Celia blinked, caught off guard. "Oh yes, he did. Old things, mostly, locked away in his study." "Why?" "Oh, no reason," Miss Marple said lightly, setting her cup down. "Only that people who admire dangerous objects sometimes underestimate how easily they can be turned against them." Hewitt gave a faint smile, but her hand trembled as she placed her own cup on the saucer, not from grief, Miss Marple noted, but from tension. It was a small thing, barely visible. But it was enough. As Miss Marple rose to leave, she glanced once more toward the mantelpiece. There, among the flowers and condolence cards, sat a small decorative pistol, silver-plated, its barrel dulled with age. A trinket, perhaps, or perhaps something else. Either way, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it just long enough to note the faint trace of soot near the trigger. That evening, the village settled once more beneath its blanket of snow, but there was no peace to be found in Old Manor House. Light still burned in its windows, and the faint murmur of voices drifted through the night as Inspector Graves conducted his second round of questioning. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat quietly at home, her lamp glowing softly on the lace tablecloth, her thoughts weaving together like the threads of her knitting. That pistol on the mantelpiece troubled her not because it was out of place, but because it was perfectly placed, as though meant to be noticed. And that, she reflected, was never the case with murder. The following morning, Inspector Graves called again, this time with an air of exhaustion and reluctant respect. "We've examined that pistol you mentioned, Miss Marple," he said. "Useless thing. Decorative, barrel blocked. Couldn't have fired a shot in years." "Ah," Miss Marple said, eyes mild. "Then its purpose was not to shoot, but to mislead." "Quite effective, I imagine." Graves frowned. "Mislead who?" "Everyone," she replied softly. "Including you, perhaps." He hesitated, then took a seat, brushing snow from his coat. "We've learned something new. The Colonel recently changed his will, left nearly everything to Mrs. Hewitt. The solicitor confirmed it yesterday. That gives her motive, doesn't it?" Miss Marple didn't answer at once. She knew human motives were rarely so tidy. "Money," she said finally, "is a most convenient reason for suspicion. But real motives tend to hide beneath smaller, more personal wrongs. Wounded pride, unspoken cruelty, humiliation, they have sharper edges than any inheritance." At that, the inspector sighed. "Then who do you suspect?" She smiled faintly. "I never suspect, Inspector. I observe." After he left, Miss Marple wrapped herself in her shawl and took a slow walk through the village. At the greengrocer's, conversation bloomed the instant she entered. Mrs. Bantry stood near the counter, voice lowered but rich with relish. "They say Celia fainted during questioning. Oh, the poor thing. Though if you ask me, she's playing the part a bit too well." Miss Marple smiled politely, purchasing a small bag of apples. "People do faint, my dear Mrs. Bantry, though sometimes not from weakness, sometimes from memory." She made her way next to the churchyard, where the caretaker was shoveling a path between the gravestones. He paused to greet her, then, lowering his voice, said, "Strange thing, miss. Someone's been to the Colonel's grave already. Fresh flowers, lilies laid this morning." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her mind sharpened. Lilies. The same scent that had hung heavily in Mrs. Hewitt's drawing room. Too early for grief, she thought. Grief blossoms slowly. Guilt, however, flowers overnight. By the time she returned home, dusk had fallen. She sat again at her window, watching as the postman made his final rounds. When he stopped at her gate and handed her a small envelope, she thanked him absently. It was addressed in a graceful, feminine hand, no return name, just the words, "Forgive me for what I saw." Inside was a single pressed sprig of mistletoe, flattened and faintly stained. Miss Marple turned it over between her fingers, thoughtful. She remembered the crushed mistletoe beneath the Colonel's hand that night, the way it had seemed too deliberate, too neat. Someone had picked it up, then dropped it again, perhaps realizing too late what it revealed. A symbol of love, of kisses stolen, of betrayal hidden beneath a holiday smile. Setting the sprig gently on her table, Miss Marple looked toward the fire and murmured to herself, "The dead may keep their silence, but the living always leave whispers behind." That night, Miss Marple could not sleep. The image of that delicate mistletoe, pressed between the pages of the anonymous note, hovered in her mind. its meaning too deliberate to ignore. Someone had seen something that weighed heavily enough to compel a silent confession, yet not enough courage to attach a name. The handwriting, she noted, had a tremor to it, not of age but of fear. She placed the letter beside her lamp, folded her hands, and thought. There were 12 guests that evening, 12 minds, 12 sets of eyes. One had seen what the others missed. The next morning dawned grey and brittle, the village softened by a veil of fog. Inspector Graves called again, his boots muddy, his expression strained. "Miss Marple," he began without ceremony. "We've had another development. The butler Merrick has disappeared. Took a bicycle from the back shed sometime during the night. No one's seen him since." "People rarely vanish without reason," Miss Marple murmured, gesturing for him to sit. "Though it's curious, isn't it, how often guilt makes people run, especially when they're not the guilty ones." He frowned. "You think someone frightened him off?" "Perhaps," she said. "Or perhaps he knew something he didn't wish to remember." She leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Inspector, did you happen to ask Merrick whether he poured the wine that evening?" "I did," Graves replied, sounding almost defensive. "He said Mrs. Hewitt handled the decanter herself, said the Colonel was particular about his port." Miss Marple nodded. "And did anyone else drink from that bottle?" He hesitated. "No, just the Colonel. But the bottle was half empty when we found it." She smiled faintly. "How fascinating. Poison, of course, is too crude for this sort of mind." "No. Whoever did this wanted immediacy. A gun for finality, not for silence. But it was never about the weapon. Inspector, it was about timing. The flickering light, the sound, the confusion. That's when it happened." Graves leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "So you believe the gun was fired during that blackout?" "Precisely. But not from across the table. It was too controlled for that. Whoever fired it was beside the Colonel." He blinked. "You mean Mrs. Hewitt? Or someone who wished us to think it was her?" Miss Marple said gently. "People are fond of simple stories, Inspector. They make for easy sleep. But life, as I've observed, is made up of contradictions." When the inspector left, Miss Marple fetched her cloak and went out once more. The fog had begun to lift, revealing the sharp outlines of cottages and chimneys. She made her way to the post office, where Miss Hartnell stood fussing over a letter, her eyes darting nervously when she saw Miss Marple approach. "Good morning, Miss Hartnell," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "How dreadful about poor Colonel Hewitt. I imagine everyone's been writing their condolences." Yes, quite," Miss Hartnell stammered, folding her envelope too quickly. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the handwriting, thin, elegant, and unmistakably the same as the anonymous note. "It's kind of you to think of Mrs. Hewitt," she said mildly. "People often need kindness when they least deserve it." Miss Hartnell flushed deeply. I didn't mean well. It's all so horrible, Miss Marple." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her arm. "My dear, sometimes silence can be mistaken for guilt, but it can also be a shield. If you saw something that night, you must tell Inspector Graves. Truth has a way of surfacing, even when buried under snow." Miss Hartnell's lips trembled. She looked away, then whispered, "I didn't mean to watch, but I couldn't help it. I saw Mrs. Hewitt. She wasn't looking at her husband. She was looking at Mr. Tresider." And with that trembling confession, Miss Marple knew the pattern was nearly complete. Love and vanity. Two of the oldest motives in existence were circling each other like shadows under candlelight. And soon, one would have to face the truth. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, merely watching the color drain from Miss Hartnell's face. The poor woman twisted her gloves nervously, her eyes darting toward the postmistress as though afraid of being overheard. Miss Marple's voice, when she spoke, was gentle but firm. "You did right to tell me, my dear. The truth seldom lies where it first appears, and a glimpse, however fleeting, can change everything." Miss Hartnell swallowed hard. "I thought, perhaps I'd imagined it. The lights flickered, and I only saw their faces for a moment. but I could swear that she wasn't looking at her husband at all. It was Mr. Tresider who caught her eye, and he looked well, frightened. Frightened, Miss Marple repeated softly. Not guilty? Miss Hartnell hesitated. No, not guilty. It was the sort of fear one feels when something terrible is about to happen, but you can't stop it. Miss Marple nodded, thanked her kindly, and left the post office with the faintest chill creeping up her spine. She walked slowly through the narrow lane, her boots crunching in the thin crust of ice that had formed overnight. If Tresider had been afraid, that suggested knowledge for knowledge, perhaps, and fear before the act was far more revealing than remorse after it. By mid-afternoon, Inspector Graves arrived again, his expression marked with fatigue and confusion. I've just come from interviewing Tresider, he announced. He swears he had nothing to do with it. Says the colonel had been threatening to expose him over some debt, but he didn't have the nerve for murder. Claims he was in love with Mrs. Hewitt. Yes, but that she'd ended things weeks ago. Did he seem truthful to you, Inspector? Graves rubbed his temples. He seemed desperate. That's for sure. I'd almost believe him, if not for the missing butler. Merrick's still nowhere to be found, and his room was completely empty. Not even a comb left behind. Miss Marple looked into the fire, eyes thoughtful. People often remove themselves from a scene when they fear blame, she said. But occasionally, they vanish because they've witnessed something too dangerous to speak of. The colonel's house was a place full of tension that night, too many secrets, too much pretending, and such places tend to breed tragedy as surely as frost breeds cracks in stone. The inspector sighed. You sound as though you know exactly who did it. Oh no, Inspector, she said softly, with that infuriating calm that always made men underestimate her. But I do have an idea about how it was done. He leaned forward eagerly, but she only smiled faintly and said, Not yet, dear. I should like to see the dining room again first, if you please. Later, as they stood once more in that grand, echoing room, Miss Marple's eyes swept over the polished table, the flickering candles, the faint scent of wax still lingering in the air. She paced slowly around the table, her fingers brushing the chair backs, her gaze pausing on the far end where Colonel Hewitt had sat. The large mirror opposite the hearth caught her attention, fine old glass, its surface showing faint distortions. She tilted her head slightly, studying its angle. Such mirrors, she murmured, were often used to watch others without seeming to. I wonder, Inspector, how many eyes truly saw the colonel that night and how many only saw reflections? Graves looked puzzled. You mean someone could have fired from the other side of the room? Possibly. Or they made it seem so. Mirrors can deceive, Inspector. And so can love. As they left the house, the dusk closing in once more, Miss Marple felt the faintest stir of certainty. The pattern was tightening, the lies beginning to fray. Someone, somewhere, was trembling because she was getting close. And Miss Marple, though gentle of manner, had never once mistaken gentleness for mercy. The following day was crisp and pale, the snow glittering like powdered glass under the morning sun. Miss Marple, wrapped in her pale blue shawl, stood before the churchyard gate watching as villagers passed, each face a mask of solemn curiosity. News of the missing butler had reignited gossip with fresh vigor, and tongues wagged freely about jealousy, theft, and secret affairs. But Miss Marple was thinking not of rumors, but of reflections, the mirror, the light, the flicker. She had slept little, her mind turning over each detail with the quiet persistence of a clock's pendulum. When Inspector Graves arrived just after noon, he looked uneasy. Miss Marple, he began. Something new has turned up. Merrick's bicycle was found in the wood by the East Road. No sign of him, but his pocket watch was there, smashed. Miss Marple raised her brows. Smashed, you say? Not dropped, then? No, quite deliberate. Someone stamped on it, by the look of it. Ah, she murmured. That suggests anger or fear. People don't break watches without reason, Inspector, Time, after all, is a witness one cannot silence. He gave her a puzzled look, but she only smiled faintly and asked, "Tell me, Inspector, was it stopped?" "Yes, at exactly 10 minutes past 9. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Then, if I'm not mistaken, we may soon discover that the time of death is not quite what it seems." They returned together to Old Manor House. The drawing room looked less like a crime scene now, but the air still carried a faint, stale scent of lilies and brandy. Celia Hewitt received them with calm composure, though her eyes held a restless brightness that made the inspector uneasy. She wore black again, but with pearls, an oddly confident choice for a woman so newly widowed. Miss Marple settled herself gently into an armchair. "I understand, Mrs. Hewitt, that you and your husband had planned a small gathering for the new year as well. Such energy. After all you've endured, it's admirable." Celia's smile flickered. "I find it better to stay occupied, Miss Marple. One mustn't dwell on tragedy." "Indeed," Miss Marple said mildly. "And yet, it's often what people do not dwell on that reveals the most. For instance, I keep thinking of the mirror. How curious that a candle should have been placed directly before it on Christmas Eve. A risky choice, don't you think? Wax stains are so difficult to remove." The widow's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. I don't know who arranged the candles. Merrick, I suppose." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once in her lap. "Ah, yes, dear Merrick. A loyal man, by all accounts. Though I'm told he disliked your late husband's temper. Perhaps that made him uncomfortable?" For a brief moment, something trembled in Mrs. Hewitt's composure, a faint tightening at the corners of her mouth, quickly concealed. "Everyone disliked my husband's temper, Miss Marple, but they tolerated it. Because they had to." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, "until someone decided they no longer had to." Celia looked away then, her hands tightening in her lap. The inspector shifted uneasily, glancing at Miss Marple, but she remained silent. Her gaze fixed on the firelight, reflecting off the mirror. It shimmered faintly, as if winking at her. When they left, the inspector exhaled sharply. "You were baiting her, Miss Marple." "Oh no," she said gently, stepping carefully onto the snowy path. "Merely giving her a mirror to look into. You see, Inspector, guilt behaves very much like candlelight. It flickers when disturbed." She paused, her breath clouding in the cold. "Now then," she added softly, "I think it's time we find poor Merrick. Dead men cannot lie, but they often tell us what the living will not." And as they walked down toward the village, the church bell began to toll, once again slow, mournful, and heavy with forewarning. The search for Merrick began that afternoon. The snow had started to thaw, leaving the paths slick with slush, and the bare branches dripped like weeping candles. Inspector Graves, accompanied by 2 constables and Miss Marple herself, moved along the east road toward the woods where the bicycle had been found. The air was damp and heavy, the kind that swallowed sound and made every footstep seem intrusive. Miss Marple walked with quiet purpose, her eyes observing the smallest details, the broken twigs, the faint indentation of a boot print near the ditch, the scraps of torn fabric caught on a bramble. When they found him, it was not as the inspector had feared. Merrick was alive, though pale and trembling, crouched behind an old stone wall near the edge of the wood. His coat was soaked through, his eyes wild with exhaustion and fear. The moment he saw the inspector, he raised his hands shakily. "I didn't do it, sir," he gasped. "I swear by all that's holy, I didn't kill him." Inspector Graves knelt beside him. "No one's accusing you yet, but you've got some explaining to do. Why run, Merrick? Where were you that night after the lights went out?" Merrick's voice cracked as he spoke. "I was in the hallway, sir. The colonel had sent me to fetch another bottle of port from the cabinet. Then the lights flickered, and I heard a pop like a cork, but sharper. When I came back in, he was slumped over. Mrs. Hewitt was standing beside him, white as a sheet. She told me to fetch the doctor. I ran, but when I came back, the pistol was gone. I swear it wasn't me who took it. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Then who did, Merrick? Think carefully. Sometimes truth hides in what frightens us most. He hesitated, licking his dry lips. I saw Mr. Tressida by the sideboard, ma'am. He was holding something in his hand, small, dark. When he saw me, he slipped it into his coat and pretended to pour a drink. I didn't say anything then. I was afraid. Inspector Graves stood abruptly. So Tressida had the gun. That changes everything. Miss Marple shook her head gently. Does it, Inspector? Fear can make people see what they expect, not what's truly there. Let us not forget. The colonel was killed almost instantly, and yet no one heard a gunshot clearly. The pop might have been a firecracker, a signal perhaps, or something meant to disguise the sound. As Merrick was escorted back to the village, Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, her eyes scanning the ground. There, half buried in the thawing snow, she spotted a small brass object, glinting faintly in the grey light. She bent and picked it up, a spent cartridge, the edge smudged with soot. She turned it over in her gloved hand and smiled almost imperceptibly. Ah, she murmured. So it was fired indoors, after all, but not where everyone thought. Later that evening, she returned to her cottage, the evidence wrapped carefully in her handkerchief. The fire burned low, and the ticking clock filled the silence. She sat down, her mind replaying the dinner scene as if she'd been there herself, the flicker of the lights, the mirror's angle, the positioning of the guests. The reflection would have shown the colonel seated upright, his back straight, his glass raised. In that brief moment of darkness, anyone standing near the hearth could have aimed at the reflection in the mirror and fired, believing the bullet would find its target through its double image. Miss Marple's lips curved in quiet satisfaction. It was clever, too clever, really. A trick of light and vanity. But human nature, she knew, always betrayed itself in the smallest ways. The killer's mistake had not been in pulling the trigger. It had been in believing no one else would see through the illusion. Outside, the last of the snow melted under the faint glow of lanterns, and Mary Mead slept, blissfully unaware that its peace was soon to be disturbed once more by the truth. The next morning dawned dim and grey, the last of the snow now reduced to streaks of slush along the hedgerows. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple moved with quiet precision. A pot of tea steamed beside her armchair, but she had scarcely touched it. The spent cartridge lay upon a folded napkin, glinting faintly in the firelight like an accusation. It was time, she thought, to test her theory not with conjecture, but with human reaction. For truth, as she knew well, was most easily drawn out when people believed they were no longer being watched. She sent a polite note to Mrs. Hewitt that morning, requesting the company of a few close friends for tea that afternoon. Inspector Graves, Mrs. Bantry, Miss Hartnell, and, most pointedly, Miss Tressida. The invitation, phrased with Miss Marple's usual gentility, was impossible to decline. By 3 o'clock, the group had gathered in her drawing-room, the air thick with politeness and suppressed curiosity. Mrs. Hewitt looked elegant but tense, her gloved hands resting too still upon her lap. Tressida appeared pale, his eyes darting to her more often than he intended. Miss Marple, seated opposite them, smiled kindly as she poured the tea. "How strange it is," she said softly, "how the most cheerful of holidays can sometimes bring out the darkest of tempers. I do hope, my dear Mrs. Hewitt, that you're feeling stronger." "I'm trying," Celia said, her tone brittle. "The village has been kind." "Oh, yes," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Almost as kind as the mirror in your dining room. I wonder, Mrs. Hewitt, whether you've noticed how clearly it reflects the place where the colonel sat. Quite fortunate, really. If one were to look at it from the hearth, one might almost believe one was seeing him directly across the table." Celia's fingers froze around her teacup. I don't quite understand." "Oh, but you do," Miss Marple said gently, her blue eyes unwavering. You see, when the lights flickered that night, there was a brief darkness followed by a flash of reflection. The shot was not fired at your husband, but at his image in the mirror. A clever illusion, but one that relied upon the killer's confidence in their own aim. A single mistake, however, gave it away. Inspector Graves leaned forward, his face taut. And that mistake? Miss Marple lifted the cartridge delicately from the napkin. The bullet was fired from near the hearth, not the table. The powder mark on the mantelpiece told me as much, and the only person standing near enough at that moment was Mr. Tressider. Tressider's face blanched. "That's absurd." I didn't." Miss Marple interrupted him softly. "No, perhaps you didn't mean to kill the Colonel at all. I suspect you meant to frighten him. A desperate young man, in love with a woman trapped in an unhappy marriage, it sounds almost romantic. Doesn't it? You fired toward the reflection, believing the glass would shatter, cause confusion, and perhaps frighten the Colonel into silence. But fate, dear Mr. Tressider, is not so tidy. The bullet struck true, through the mirror's thin surface, and found its mark." Celia gave a small, broken gasp, her hand trembling. "Paul, is it true?" He looked at her with something like despair. "He would have ruined you, Celia. Exposed everything. I only meant to warn him never to." Inspector Graves rose grimly, taking him by the arm. But Miss Marple's gaze was fixed on Celia, whose composure had dissolved at last. "You see," Miss Marple said softly, "love may lead one hand, but it is selfishness that steadies it. And in Mary Mead, even mirrors can't hide the truth forever." As Graves led Tressider away, Celia bowed her head, a tear falling silently onto her gloved hand. Miss Marple turned back to her tea, her expression calm but sorrowful. She knew too well that murder never began with hate. It began, more often than not, with love that forgot its limits. The hours following the arrest passed in a quiet, uneasy hush. Mary Mead, though accustomed to small dramas and whispered scandals, was not built to absorb the shock of murder, especially one committed by a young man who had once sung carols with the church choir and helped elderly ladies carry their parcels from the shop. That evening, lamplight glowed faintly through lace curtains, and the usual gossip that fluttered from doorstep to doorstep was subdued, almost reverent. People spoke of Miss Marple with awe, now softly, as though she were not merely clever, but touched with something uncanny, the kind of insight one didn't question but feared a little. At her cottage, Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The flames flickered low, and the ticking clock filled the silence with its steady pulse. Inspector Graves had left hours ago, thanking her in his awkward, boyish way. Though she had noticed the unease in his eyes, the case had resolved neatly. Yes, but not comfortably. Death, Miss Marple reflected, never sat comfortably on the human conscience, no matter how well explained. And this one, she felt, was not quite finished. There were small inconsistencies, minor perhaps, but she never ignored such things. The mirror, for instance. A bullet had struck through it cleanly, but when she had examined it again after Tressider's confession, she had noticed the crack ran diagonally, not from the center as she expected, but from the lower corner. That was no accident of trajectory. It meant the shot had come from an angle slightly lower, as though fired by someone seated, not standing. And yet Tressider had been by the hearth, upright, according to every witness. The thought unsettled her, but she said nothing. Instead, she poured herself a fresh cup of tea and allowed her mind to wander through the labyrinth of that evening one final time. The laughter, the flicker of the lights, the shattered glass, the scream. The mirror had reflected not only the Colonel, but everyone facing him. And there, perhaps, lay the truth. The following morning she walked, without announcement, to Old Manor House. The servants had gone, and the place felt hollow, stripped of its festive charm. Celia Hewitt greeted her with strained politeness, her eyes red but dry. "I don't imagine you've come to gloat, Miss Marple," she said bitterly. "Oh, my dear, Miss Marple replied gently. Gloating is for those who are certain of their conclusions. I never am. I've come to ask a single question, though you may not wish to answer it. When you screamed that night, was it before or after the colonel fell? Celia hesitated, color draining from her cheeks. I don't know. Everything happened so quickly. Miss Marple nodded. Quite. Because you didn't scream at the sight of him dying. Mrs. Hewitt, you screamed when you realized he wasn't meant to. Celia's lips parted, but no words came. Miss Marple's tone remained mild, almost kind. You see, I rather think it wasn't Mr. Tressida who fired the fatal shot at all. He may have aimed in foolish bravado, but the pistol in the colonel's collection had already been tampered with. You loaded it yourself earlier that day, didn't you? You made sure it would fire when he handled it. You only hadn't counted on Tressida's little show of courage. When he pulled the trigger, he simply released the death you had already arranged. Celia's hands shook violently. You can't prove that. No, Miss Marple said softly, but you'll find that truth requires very little proof once one's conscience begins to whisper. And yours, I think, will not stay quiet for long. Miss Marple left her standing there, motionless in the pale winter light. Outside, the snow had melted entirely, leaving the world bare again. The village would heal, as it always did, but for Miss Marple, the lesson remained unchanged, that beneath every act of passion lies a far older motive, the quiet, selfish terror of losing control. Celia Hewitt stood in the dim light of the drawing room long after Miss Marple had gone. The quiet tick of the mantel clock pressed against her ears like a heartbeat she couldn't silence. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the frosted panes, and she drew her shawl tighter. But it was not the cold that made her tremble. The old lady's words still echoed, gentle, unhurried, and yet sharp enough to pierce through every layer of denial she had built around herself. Miss Marple had not accused her outright. She hadn't needed to. Truth, Celia thought, had a way of standing quietly in the corner until one's eyes could no longer avoid it. She moved to the mirror, the same mirror that had once reflected a glittering dinner table, laughter, and the illusion of a perfect marriage. Now, it only returned her own pale, strained face. A small fracture ran across the glass, like a wound that refused to heal. She lifted a trembling hand, tracing it with her fingertip. Yes, the old woman had seen too much. She had always been kind to Celia, but her kindness had teeth. When the colonel's cruelty had become unbearable, his temper, his threats, his humiliation, Celia had told herself she could endure it. But then came the will, rewritten to ensure she would have nothing. It was as though he meant to make her a prisoner even after his death. She had not planned it at first. It had come to her suddenly, while polishing the silver pistol in his study, a curious old piece he loved to show off. One small adjustment to the mechanism, just enough to make it fire with the slightest pressure. She had thought, coldly, that it would look like an accident. A misfire during his evening demonstration. She never expected Paul Tressida, with his reckless devotion, to interfere that night. The tragedy had unfolded with almost poetic irony, one final act of cruelty from fate itself. And now she was alone with the weight of it, surrounded by the ghosts of her own making. A knock startled her. She turned sharply, her breath catching, but it was only Inspector Graves. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, hat in hand, his eyes uncertain. "Mrs. Hewitt," he said quietly, "I've come to tell you that Mr. Tressida has been formally charged, but Miss Marple asked me to stop by. She thought you might have something further to say." Celia stared at him, her voice barely a whisper. "She sent you?" "Yes, ma'am. Said she thought the air might be clearer today." Her words, not mine. Celia gave a hollow laugh. "Clearer. Yes, that's one way to put it." She turned back toward the mirror. "Inspector, do you ever wonder what people see when they look at themselves after committing something unforgivable?" He hesitated. "I think they see what they've always been, ma'am, only more honestly." Her eyes filled. and she reached for the edge of the mantel to steady herself. "Tell her," she said at last, her voice breaking. "Tell Miss Marple she's right, about everything." I loaded the pistol. I meant him to die, but not like that, not in front of everyone. I thought it would be quieter, cleaner. I didn't mean to make Paul part of it. The inspector stood still, his face unreadable. "I'll tell her, ma'am." When he left, the house seemed to exhale with him. Celia sank into the nearest chair, feeling the weight of her confession settle into her bones. Outside, church bells rang faintly through the mist, their sound soft, almost forgiving. But she knew forgiveness wasn't something one could borrow from sound or prayer. It had to come from within, and hers was long spent. Across the village, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the snow return in delicate spirals. She closed her knitting quietly and sighed a small sound of both sadness and inevitability. The matter, at last, was over, yet, as always, she felt no triumph. Only the deep, weary understanding that human weakness was as constant as the turning of seasons. Christmas would come again next year, she thought, and with it, another story of kindness and cruelty intertwined beneath the holly and the mistletoe. Inspector Graves returned just after noon, hat dripping from a string of thawing icicles, and found Miss Marple laying the tea. He looked older than he had the day before, as though the night had pressed a thumb upon his brow and left an indelible mark. She motioned him to the chair nearest the fire and poured without ceremony. He held the cup with both hands, grateful for the warmth, then cleared his throat with the air of a man who wishes to speak and dreads the words. "She's confessed," he said at last. "Mrs. Hewitt, not in so many words to me, but near enough. She admits loading a pistol from the colonel's study earlier in the day. She claims she thought it might discharge if he handled it. He liked to show it off to guests, she said. Thought it would look like an accident." He stared into the rising steam. Only Tressida fired it first. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes. The pattern is always more complicated than the moral. Love begins the embroidery. Selfishness knots the thread." He looked up, uncomprehending. "Then where do we stand? Legally, I mean." Tressida fired the shot into the mirror, by your account. The bullet went through and struck the colonel. But the weapon was made lethal by Mrs. Hewitt's interference. It's as if she set a trap and he sprung it. "That is very nearly what happened," Miss Marple said gently. "Only the trap required a stage and the proper lighting cue." He sat back. "Tell me the whole of it, if you please." Miss Marple folded, her hands, her voice even. Celia Hewitt had lived under a domestic dictatorship for some time. Little cruelties, sharp humiliations, and, most dangerous of all, the sense that she would be discarded without resource. When the new will was drawn, she understood that the colonel intended to keep his power over her even from the grave. Such men often cannot resist the posthumous gesture. Graves nodded bleakly. "I've seen it." "She visited the study that afternoon," Miss Marple continued. While polishing a small service pistol, one of two tucked away among curios, she slipped in a cartridge and made a subtle adjustment to the spring. A light pressure would set it off. She placed that particular pistol not back into its locked cabinet, but into the sideboard drawer near the hearth, where she could reach it, and where a desperate young man might too. The inspector frowned. How could she be certain he'd find it? She could not be certain, Miss Marple said, but she knew Mr. Tressida's temperament. She had already cooled their affair, yet left him with the warmth of hope that is the most combustible fuel. When a man like that sees the woman he adores publicly belittled by a husband he secretly hates, he grows theatrical. Mrs. Hewitt arranged a table that encouraged theatrics. The mirror opposite the colonel, a candle placed to draw the eye to that glass, mistletoe ready to be raised in a smiling taunt, something to sting the colonel's vanity and stir the room. Graves's gaze flicked up, sharp, the mistletoe under the colonel's hand. Precisely. She had it in her fingers when the lights dipped. Miss Marple said softly. A laughing challenge. Perhaps, kiss me if you dare. The sort of thing to prick a tyrant. In that heartbeat of darkness, Mr. Tresider, already close to the hearth, found the sideboard drawer where she had mislaid the pistol earlier. He meant to frighten the colonel. He raised the weapon toward the reflection. Men do enjoy dramas of aim and bravado, and fired, expecting shattered glass, a shout, an instant of panic to cover his retreat. The mirror did crack, Graves muttered, but not centrally, because he fired from a lower angle, braced half-kneeling by the fender. Miss Marple said, "Your watch in the wood, Merrick's, was not meant to set the time of death, but to blot out a different memory. He stamped it later, poor man, because he thought it would fix the moment and spare him questions about what he'd seen. He had run for the doctor as ordered. He returned to chaos and terror. The precise minute was merely one more thing he wished not to remember. People protect themselves with little lies. One should not be harsh with them." The inspector let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since Christmas Eve. "And the cartridge you found?" "Ejected clumsily near the hearth," Miss Marple said. "Not thrown far, because Mr. Tresider's panic was the sort that freezes rather than flees. He tried to pocket the pistol. Merrick glimpsed a small, dark object, which a frightened mind renders as guilt, but the weapon had already left its signature. Powder smudged the mantel and the mirror's lower corner. Only later, when people gathered round the body, did Mrs. Hewitt, with a quick little movement and her theatrical scream, draw everyone's eyes away from where the shot had actually been fired. Graves rubbed his jaw. "You called her scream theatrical from the first." "I called its timing theatrical," Miss Marple corrected gently. "It came a fraction late. That belongs to calculation, not shock." He stared into the coals, then said, very low, "We'll have to alter the charge." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "The law will decide degrees of culpability. But if you wish to know the human truth, he acted in folly. She acted in design. It is the design that darkens." He stood, squared by duty once more. "I'll see to it." He paused at the door, hat in hand. "You are very kind, Miss Marple, in your way." "In my way," she agreed, and smiled as the latch clicked behind him. News seeped through Mary Mead as water threads, a cloth quiet, inevitable. Mrs. Bantry called, full of shocked compassion and guilty relief at being involved in a story that was not hers. She brought seed cake and the latest speculations, which Miss Marple received with gratitude and sifted with care. The vicar's wife, pained and penitent, worried about Miss Hartnell's conscience. Miss Marple assured her that Miss Hartnell had already done the bravest thing. She had seen, and then she had said. Merrick, summoned again to the station but treated gently, wept with the enormous exhaustion of a man who has been forced to carry more truth than his shoulders were built for. That evening, snow began once more. It came thinly at first, then thicker, softening the hard lines of roofs and hedges, laying quiet upon the village green. Miss Marple drew her curtains later than usual and stood for a time with the lamplight at her back, watching the flakes tumble under the halo of the street lantern. In the glass, her own face floated like a pale moon, and behind it the cozy room, and behind that memory upon memory, so many tragedies wearing ordinary clothes. She sat and took up her knitting, but did not begin. Instead, she thought of Celia Hewitt, sitting somewhere in the wide, echoing rooms of Old Manor House, hearing every tick of the clock as if it counted out a sentence. It was not triumph, Miss Marple felt. It never was. It was the steady ache of understanding that people most often break where they have most carefully concealed the crack. A domineering husband, a frightened lover, a clever arrangement with a candle and a mirror, a little sprig of mistletoe turned into a signpost for murder. In the end, what undid them all was not the bullet or the glass, but the vanity of believing one could urge fate to be tidy. Fate is never tidy. It is human. The next morning, Inspector Graves returned one last time. He did not come in. The matter was formal now. He only lifted a hand at the gate, his breath ghosting in the cold. "It's being set right," he said. "As right as such things can be." Be kind to Merrick, Miss Marple said. He will blame himself forever if you allow it. We will be, he promised. He hesitated. There'll be talk of you, you know. There is always talk, Miss Marple replied, smiling. It keeps people warm. He touched the brim of his hat and went away, leaving crisp boot marks that the snow immediately began to soften and swallow. On Christmas Day, the choir sang "In the Bleak Midwinter," and the village listened as though every verse explained something essential about endurance. Mrs. Bantry squeezed Miss Marple's hand in the pew and whispered, "My dear, if I were ever murdered, I should like you to arrange it." Miss Marple whispered back, "I shall do my best never to be given the opportunity." They smiled in the way of old friends who have weathered each other's tempers and foolishness and know precisely where the kindness is buried. After the service, villagers exchanged parcels and little bows and promises to call. Children dragged their sledges across the lane and begged to make just one more run before the light went. The world insisted on living. Miss Marple walked home slowly, savoring the creak of snow underfoot, the flake that dared settle on her sleeve, the chill that bit the nose, and then retreated before a sensible scarf. At her gate, she paused and looked back down the road toward the manor, its chimneys a faint smudge behind the trees. Somewhere within, a woman had at last told the truth out loud, and a young man had learned what it meant to confuse courage with display. Somewhere else, a servant was relearning the simple art of sleeping through the night. Such were the arithmetic of consequences, not elegant, rarely fair, always human. She went in, set the kettle, and chose a new skein of wool, a soft winter blue. As the water began its friendly burble, Miss Marple threaded the yarn and cast on 30 stitches, then 30 more. The pattern would be simple. The warmth would be sufficient. Outside, the snow fell steadily upon Mary Mead, drawing a clean page over the smudges of recent days. Inside, Miss Marple began her work again, content with the small, faithful acts that keep a life in order. Hot tea, neat stitches, a mind alert to the ways people stumble and, sometimes, rise. She did not think of mirrors or pistols now. She thought, instead, of how often cruelty is just fear with hard edges, and how kindness, properly applied, can wear those edges down before anyone bleeds. And if, now and then, the fire popped like a cork and she lifted her head, listening, it was not from dread, but from habit. She had learned across many winters that danger and love arrive on the same quiet feet. When they came again, as they always did, she would be ready with tea, with listening, and with that small, inexorable mercy the village never recognized as skill until the moment it saved them.